How long does the Jackbox Survey Scramble have left to live? Now, I'm aware that this is a very melodramatic question, and it was partly written this way for the start of the video just to hook you in and artificially raise the stakes of the matter, but there is something I've come across recently concerning this game that has me, for lack of a better word, concerned. Concerned about the longevity of the Jackbox Survey Scramble as the constantly updating product it currently is and is advertised to be. But what exactly is this thing I've come across? Well, I'll get to that very shortly, but first, allow me to thank you all for 1,000 subscribers. Genuinely, 1,000 is a pretty big number for an amount of people that all decided to continue supporting my content, and it still boggles my mind that we even got there in the first place. I can now officially don the title of YouTube micro-celebrity. Also, I hope you like the new room. I'm hoping it'll be a little more permanent than the last few ones. But enough about that. So, what exactly got me concerned about the future of the Jackbox Survey Scramble to begin with? Well, to answer that question, let me first go over the most recent update. Now, the Jackbox Survey Scramble received a small but significant update on the 5th of June 2025, and I'm willing to bet that most of you didn't even know it came out, let alone what it even added. And no, this update I'm talking about doesn't have anything to do with the content update Jackbox advertised on their Instagram and Steam news page on the 14th of April and the 8th of May respectively. Besides, these content updates don't do anything to the local side of the game. They're just simple data updates on the server side to tell the local part of the game that a prompt that already exists in the files is now available for regular play instead of either exclusively in the lobby or nowhere at all. These aren't really updates in the traditional sense. No, what I'm talking about is an update to the game itself that adds a really useful engine change that also raises a really interesting implication. Introducing Build 540. So let's go over its features and its interesting implications for the future of the Jackbox Survey Scramble. This update provides a new backup procedure during the voting segment when all the lists for the provided categories are meant to download. So without further ado, let's go over the new downloading system for playable lists in the voting segment. To start off, when a mode is selected for play, 3 random categories are selected for voting before the name of the game mode flies onto the screen. For each one, the following process is performed to attempt to retrieve a playable list for the game. If you already have a version of a category's list in your system's cache and it shares the same file name tag as the server's app config, the category's list in your cache will be used for play, no downloads required. If this cache isn't selected immediately, this can mean one of a few things. Either the list in your cache is out of date, it's formatted incorrectly, you're currently playing the game on a locale that differs from your cache of that specific category, a combination of these things, or you've simply never seen the category appear in a voting segment after the release of the Dares and Dash update when caching was first introduced. In any case, if your cache of a category has either of these issues, the game will attempt to download that category's list directly from Jackbox's servers. If the game succeeds in downloading a category's list, the download will successfully be used for play, and it will also be saved to your cache on your local system, along with its file name and locale for future use/comparison. However, if for whatever reason the game cannot download a category's list from the servers after this, it will attempt to make its first compromise. If the game can't get any up-to-date data for a category, it will look in your cache to see if you have any outdated cache of a category from a previous playthrough in the same locale as what you're currently playing in. If you do have any older cache in the same locale, that list will be chosen for play, but the category as a whole will be placed at a lower priority due to having out-of-date data. What does lower priority mean? We'll get to that. Now, here's where the new functionality of Build 540 comes in. If you don't have any cache of a category whatsoever, or its cache doesn't match the current locale in play, and the game can't download the latest list of a category from the server, the game will attempt to use its last resort. If all else fails, the game will look for a local equivalent of a category's list in your current locale and your language's equivalent of the new content file bigsurveylist.jet and use that as the list in play for that category. In turn, as this is the last resort, the category as a whole will be marked at the lowest priority. And finally, if a category can't obtain a list from any of the previously listed methods, then the category as a whole will be deemed completely unplayable. But if a category can't get a list whatsoever when it loads, the game won't tell you this now. The voting screen will still display all of the categories for voting like usual, regardless of each category's state in terms of their list data. But don't worry, regardless of the states of all the categories, the game still has one final trick up its sleeve, and that one trick is to rig the election. After everyone votes on a category to play, the game will check the status of the list content of the category that received the most votes. If the assigned list content for that category is up to date, the category is chosen for play, and our fellow players get to reap the benefits of democracy. But if it doesn't, the game will take matters into its own hands. Starting from the bottom up, the game will check the other categories in rotation to see if they have up-to-date data. The first one that does will be chosen for play. But if none of these categories have up-to-date data, it starts the cycle again, this time looking for lower priority out-of-date cache data. First checking the most voted category for out-of-date cache data, then looking through the other categories from the bottom up. Again, the first category to be checked this way with complete data will be selected for play. And if there's no cache data in any of the following categories to work with whatsoever, the cycle repeats one last time, this time looking for local data as a last resort. And if by some stroke of bad luck none of the available categories have any local data, then the game simply can't progress and you all get kicked back into the lobby with an error message. Congratulations, you just got dealt the worst possible hand. So that's the current list selection system, with all things server data, cache data, and newly introduced from build 540, local data. Now, you may be asking yourself, why did I just listen to any of that? And what does any of this have to do with your concerns on the Jackbox Survey Scramble's longevity? Well, I'll tell you. The main reason this new update gives me concerns for the future of the Jackbox Survey Scramble doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the performance of the engine change. In fact, I think this list gathering function is the most functional it's ever been. No, my concern comes from the very fact that the game is already using a database of unchanging answers on your local machine, taking measures to prepare for the eventual halt on support for constant online list updates. Now, this practice on its own isn't a bad thing, but the game hasn't even been out for a full year and it's already preparing for the worst? And then I kept digging. After a period of routinely looking at the game's online app config, which is what controls things like what surveys are only allowed exclusively in the lobby and what timestamps the game's online data is currently using, it turns out, as of the production of this video, the game's online list data for all languages was last updated on the 18th of July. But the previous time that the lists were updated for most locales before then was on the 21st of May. In my time zone, NZST. That's a waiting time of nearly 2 whole months without a single list update. And the previous update that the list received before the 17th of July for United States English specifically was on the 5th of April. Again, in my time zone. That's over 3 whole months without a single list update. So, not to doom post, but with the game now pulling from old locally based answers as a backup, and with the online list updates themselves also slowing down significantly, it brings me back to this question. How long does the Jackbox Survey Scramble have left to live? Now, here's the thing. As long as Jackbox.tv is up and running, I really don't think that the lists on the servers completely shutting down is going to be a major issue. After all, this very game quite simply could not exist in the way that it does if Jackbox Games wasn't able to manage online-based games anyways. And considering the general non-hardcore populace of people that own a Jackbox title, I'll be honest, as long as packs 3 through 7 are still on the market, Jackbox.tv won't be going anywhere. But the problem partly lies within the popularity of the Jackbox Survey Scramble itself. Sure, the servers behind Jackbox.tv as a whole will still be popular as long as the party packs are around, but the lists behind the gameplay of the Jackbox Survey Scramble are on a part of the server that's relatively independent, and one look at the Steam DB page for this game can tell you that 1. People love to play Jackbox on New Year's, and 2. It is far from the most popular Jackbox title out there. And that's a real shame because in my opinion, the Jackbox Survey Scramble is the best product Jackbox has released since Pack 7. But unfortunately, its obscurity as of current isn't doing the game any favors. So how prepared would we be if the online lists were to be shut down right now? Let's take a look at what's currently supported by the game servers and what's supported by the local files and use these findings to see how well equipped we would be if the online lists were to suddenly disappear. You know you love it, it's time for some good old statistics. To start off, let's establish just how much content we're working with as our base point. Firstly, each English locale has a total content pool of 253 survey categories, and of these 253 English categories, 2 of these were previously playable lists that have since been completely banned from both gameplay and the lobby, these being IDs 104579, overrated tourist destinations, and 105436, most annoying places. I know, shocker, bet you can't guess why those ones got removed from the roster. Anyways, every other locale has a total content pool of 255 categories. Why us English players get 2 less categories, I couldn't tell you. So now that we have our benchmark, let's first take a look at how many lists are explicitly supported by the servers as of the 18th of July. As you can see here, as of this date, list support for all languages is fairly similar, generally floating around the 170s or from 67 to 70%, with an increase in supported lists for our German community at an impressive 197 supported lists, or 77.25%. But this doesn't paint the full picture, and you'll see it so soon enough. Because all English content shares the same ID regardless of the locale-specific lists, the servers have to lump the availability of English categories together, so this skews the actual support for these locales a little bit. Got all that? Hope so. Now let's move on to the new stuff. How many categories can the local list pool support? Well, let's find out. Now, here's where things get interesting. All non-English languages have the exact same number or slightly less supported lists on the local side than the online side as expected, a difference of around 0 to 6. But the English locales? Great Britain's local support drops from 174 to 155, and Australia's all the way down to 144. That's a lost difference of 19 lists and a whopping 30 lists respectively. Conversely, the United States has the complete opposite effect to a comical degree. The United States English locale supports 240 local lists, or almost 95%. That's a gaining difference of 66 lists, a 26% increase. Now, need I remind you, currently you can only play the lists enabled for play on the server side, so you won't need to worry about the currently supported local lists too much right now. But thinking about a possible future of the game here, in the event that, hypothetically, Jackbox were to update their servers right now to only allow lists that are currently supported by your local files, what would it look like? Let's analyze a possible reality of what the game could look like if we couldn't download a single list from the servers ever again. Well, the statistics don't lie, so I'll be completely straight for this first point. For starters, in the short term at least, everyone except the United States will be worse off. I know, typical. According to our previous findings, most locales support a slightly lower number of lists locally than what's supported currently online, while the United States would suddenly be granted another 66 lists to play with out of the blue, assuming we aren't lumping English list availability through one source at this point like we are currently. But don't worry too much, my fellow brethren from literally every other country. As long as you have a cache of a list that currently isn't supported locally, you'd still be able to play it, provided you haven't switched languages since the last time it appeared in a voting screen. But this hypothetical only concerns lists that are supported locally, so let's ignore that little detail regarding non-local lists for now. But cache data will still play a big role. If you recall the workings of the list selection system I dissected earlier, you'll remember that categories with cache data will take priority over categories with only local data in voting segments. This means that if you've seen a certain category in a voting segment after the 8th of May when Build 540 was presumably finalized, not released, that's different, then there's a very real chance that you'll have cache data of a list that could have some slight differences to the local equivalent in the game's main files. What does this mean? Well, a couple things. The good news is that as long as you have cache, you can play a number of categories with lists that are more up to date than their local counterparts. But this comes with some pitfalls. Firstly, if the lists were to shut down online, you wouldn't be able to change the timestamp or the language of the list on your cache ever again, since you wouldn't be able to download anything from the servers. Playing a category with a cached list that has a different locale than the one in play will simply force the game to use the local equivalent instead in this scenario. But without an online server to download lists from, caching creates a whole different problem. This being that as long as you have valid cache of one of the categories in a voting segment, any other category in that same voting segment list that only has local data will simply never be considered for play, because cached lists just have higher priority. Now, in the hypothetical scenario where the online lists are shut down, particularly for the United States players, this means that any cache you have could actively prevent you from playing certain categories that only have local data. In this scenario, if everyone votes on a category that only has local data, but there's at least one cached category to choose from, the cached category will always be picked regardless of what people chose, undermining the democracy of your fellow players. Gosh, why am I using so much political language? This is a Jackbox video, for goodness sake. Regardless, if the server's shut down, having cached data will inevitably create this issue of making every other non-cached category that much harder to select in the voting segment. So would it be worth clearing your cache to give locally supported lists a better shot at being chosen for play instead of simply being at the mercy of your cached data? Maybe. For United States players specifically, I would definitely consider it. But in any case, with cache or without cache, if the online lists were no longer supported, then no matter what, the game would then have to face its biggest obstacle. The obstacle that goes against the very nature of the game as of current, and against what the Jackbox Survey Scramble was advertised to be. Without online list data, the Jackbox Survey Scramble will become static. What used to be a dynamic game with lists that would constantly update will eventually become a game where the lists become stationary, and the answers and the rankings can be memorized. So what will happen to the game if it becomes completely dependent on local data, and what aspects of the Jackbox Survey Scramble will suffer the most when this happens? Well, let's talk about it. Now, before we get into the major consequences of an online list shutdown, I'd like to briefly touch on one implication this event could bring that I just find hilarious to think about. Obviously, if you've played the Jackbox Survey Scramble at any point after the release of the Dares and Dash update, you'll likely have cached lists on your system, right? And we've already established that cached lists will take priority over local lists no matter their creation date, correct? Well, with these facts in mind, it's highly likely that many owners of the Jackbox Survey Scramble will have a different combination of cached lists of different languages and timestamps. What this means is that while the game would largely be using local lists that will likely stay the same forever, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will be playing with the same list data from that point forward, meaning that as long as players still have cached data from before the server lists shut down, list data can have a plethora of subtle differences between different devices and users. Or, if you were the type to quickly jump to conclusions, you could say that every copy of the Jackbox Survey Scramble is personalized. Move aside, Super Mario 64, we've got a real conspiracy on our hands. I swear, if the online lists do shut down and it gets announced, I cannot wait for people to slowly but surely notice this stuff despite the game being deemed locally based, and then going on to create conspiracy theories claiming that every copy of the Jackbox Survey Scramble is personalized to create the illusion of updating lists. And here I'll be denouncing the theories like the killjoy I am. So that's definitely the more light-hearted implication, but let's take a more analytical look. If we were to treat the Jackbox Survey Scramble like any other Jackbox trivia game, in the event that online lists were to stop being supported, which game modes would become trivialized the fastest with memorization, and what game modes would suffer the most? Well, allow me to give my own personal rankings and explain my thought process behind each one. Kicking things off, I personally believe that Squares is the game mode that will be the worst off from using static lists, and here's why. In Squares, squares are claimed on the board when your team submits an answer within a square's designated range, and if you manage to submit the highest answer in a range, you get to lock that range's square, preventing it from ever being stolen. And this functionality right here is exactly what makes this mode suffer the most from static content. All you need to do is memorize the answers on the list specifically ranked 1, 3, 6, 11, 16, 21, 31, 51, and 71. The moment you do that, congratulations! You've successfully reduced squares to tic-tac-toe in its most basic form, which, if you get selected to go first, is pretty hard to lose. Meaning, with a few memorized answers, squares will transform from a game of strategy to a game of complete luck, straight up. Now, the next most modes that I think would suffer hardest would be Dares and High-Low. Now, both of these modes are hard to place on a ranking like this because how much memorization can tank the experience of these modes is heavily dependent on a couple of factors. For example, if you're only playing one round with a minimum player count of 2, there is very little you have to memorize to perfect your gameplay, and if played this way, both Dares and High-Low could legitimately create a worse gameplay experience with memorization than Squares. A maximum player count of 10 alone is what incentivizes you to remember the top and bottom 10 answers for a round of Dares rather than just the top top and bottom too. And because Hilo asks you to submit a high answer and a low answer twice each, in a max player game of Hilo with the point split setting enabled, you'd be incentivized to memorize the top and bottom 20, as preparation for the mind games at play to try and avoid point splits with the 9 other survey buffs in your lobby. Though I think turning the point split setting off would do great harm to Hilo in a memory-based environment. But the one thing that really bumps both of these modes up above squares in this alternate reality is the keep going setting. If your group decides to commit to staying on the same list for a large number of additional rounds, naturally in a memory-based environment, more and more of the highest and lowest answers will be used up early on, and the longer you play, the closer you'll get to playing with just the middle entries of the list, which don't hold many incentives for memory. Meaning that this feature alone brings both Dares and Hilo higher up than squares in a world of only static lists. So with that in mind, the current rankings of modes that would suffer the most from memory goes squares, Dares, and Hilo. So what's next? Next would be Dash, and this is where memorization starts to get a little bit unreasonable. For Dash, you need to memorize the rankings of the top 100 answers in any given list. 100 answers is a lot, and while it's far from a survey's maximum of 500, memorizing the ranks of 100 answers for every list is still a massive ask. Dash will also only ever reveal the ranking of the most popular answer for each question, so it'll take more time to get ranking information from this mode than many of the others. Next, I think would be Speed. Yes, you are incentivized to memorize an entire list, which is a much bigger ask than memorizing the top and bottom 20, but rankings aren't an issue here. If memorizing the rankings of an answer made it harder to remember more of them as a whole, then you don't need to worry about that here. Part of the reason why I also rank this one as a higher sufferer than a few others is because the unlimited speed setting and the no timer setting literally gives you the space to look for every answer on a list and their rankings at whatever pace you want, which is very directly contributing to the memorization problem, since you can just use it as a mode to test your memory on a particular list. Pegs also has a similar issue to Speed because it's incredibly similar to Speed with no timers from a gameplay perspective, but the reason I rank this one as suffering less than Speed is because Pegs doesn't tell you the rankings of any given answer you type, but you are incentivized to have a general understanding of the rankings of many answers due to the rankings effect on the size of the balls you drop. But let's be real, who's still playing Pegs these days? Actually, follow-up question, who even knew Pegs existed? Second to last, we have Scroll, the other beta game mode. Now, this mode doesn't require you to know any of the entries on the list or their rankings because this mode is focused on creating comedy, in air quotes, so memorization isn't exactly an issue here. However, Scroll has always had a problem with replayability since only 15 categories in the entire game fully support the mode, 7 of which are not supported on the server end in all English locales, 1 of which was supported but is now completely banned in all English locales, and anywhere from 1 to 3 are not supported on every other locale apart from Germany, which has every scroll prompt available to them right now. Now, for most locales, switching to exclusively local lists wouldn't do anything to change the availability of certain scroll prompts, but for the English locales, it's an entirely different story. Australia's locale would gain 1 extra prompt, Great Britain's locale would get 2 extra prompts, and the United States would get to play every single scroll prompt in the game. Aside from 1 that's been recently taken out of the roster and is banned from ever being seen again casually in the foreseeable future. So for us English speakers, Scroll would actually become more replayable in this hypothetical local apocalypse. Unless of course we still rely on a lumping system for all English lists regardless of locales, in which case literally nothing about this game mode would change. And lastly, okay, I'll be totally honest, I think bounce would improve. Just think about it. If you memorize the rankings of the top 50 answers of a list, or the top 100, or the top 250 depending on your answer range setting, and you play against someone else that has also memorized the ranks of all these answers, you can bring the game to a point where Bounce starts to focus less on being able to gather unique answers and more on the speed at which you can place answers down to deflect the ball. In other words, the more you memorize a list, Bounce will start to transform from a trivia action hybrid to more of a purely skill-based game than ever before, and I think that's a good thing. You could be more adventurous with the speed and acceleration settings, and you could have faster paced, more frantic games of Bounce than ever before. Truly I say, if the Jackbox Survey Scramble ended up switching to only local lists, it would be a day of rejoicing for all 2 people in the competitive Bounce community. So why did I just tell you any of this? Well, quite simply, it's because I want to think ahead for this potential future on the horizon. Yes, it is a monumental task for people to memorize anywhere from 9 to 120 answers and their rankings on every list in the game, and the average player is only going to remember the placements of a few answers from each list, if even that. But I think stuff like this is just generally important to think about when concerning the longevity of this game. The Jackbox Survey Scramble was advertised as a game that is constantly updating with an ever-growing database, yet it hasn't even been a year and look at it now. The lists online have currently been stagnant for over a month, and local preparations have been made to make the game playable with local content. And the longer the game's content stays stagnant, the higher the possibility of it transforming into a static trivia game based on survey answers that will no longer change. Like espionage, the very thing that the Jackbox Survey Scramble swore to destroy. And what happens to a trivia game that advertises infinite replayability when it can only gather a finite amount of content? It will eventually become predictable. And that's exactly why I think about this hypothetical scenario in the way that I do. I want to think about this alternate reality in a way that prepares us for the worst. So what can we do? Well, I'll be entirely honest, the stagnation of the online lists for the Jackbox Survey Scramble was always going to be an issue that the game would have to face at one point or another. What I'm concerned about is the speed it seems to be coming. Again, the game hasn't even been out for a full year, and it's already made preparations for the eventual decline in the game's popularity. I mean, it's already lasted longer than a few other online titles, Concord, but this kind of preparation does still feel a little early, don't you think? So whether you like it or not, we do have to think about this reality. So what can we as a community do to address this potential future state of the game? Well, there are a couple things. Firstly, something I've done personally. Since Build 540 released, adding support for locally based lists with their own systems, I've finally been motivated to take another crack at creating support for fully customizable local lists, and I've created an all-new mod that aims to provide proper support for that very thing. Introducing Local Mode. Work in progress. Local Mode aims to provide a space to create all new Survey Scramble categories with locally based lists, whether trivia-based, statistics-based, or even just your own opinions. What this mode does is it pulls content and lists from an entirely different set of local files than your standard surveys and ignores the downloading process entirely, forcing lists from the appropriate local file 100% of the time. Any answers submitted to the game through gameplay will not be sent back to the servers in this mode, as not to pollute Jackbox's database with data they can't use, but you can still submit answers to vanilla surveys in the lobby like normal. Currently, I've only written a couple lists for this mod because, I'll be honest, writing massive lists manually for a game like this in a static state like this is usually not worth the effort, and it's quite hard to write meaningful lists in this format for speed specifically. So as much as this mod could bring some life back into the game, I personally would only pursue writing more local Survey Scramble content for special events and such. Think of this mod as a proof of concept more than anything. I might put a link to it in the description, as well as possibly a general guide for use, but it will definitely assume that you have at least some experience in modding to write your own content. This is definitely more a mod for the hypothetical local apocalypse, but it could still be fun to mess around with right now if it tickles your fancy. But what's something we can all do to delay this fate? Well, it's a very simple idea and an incredibly cliche call to action, but quite simply, we should just be playing the game. The Jackbox Survey Scramble is one of my favorite Jackbox products as of recent, and I would dare say that it is the best product this company has released since Pack 7. For only $10 US, you can get a hold of 6 different minigames in one package, technically 8 if you know how to access the beta stuff, as well as an unused tournament-style win condition. The beta content has been such an engaging study into how Jackbox develops their games, and this is easily the most customizable Jackbox game on the market. I mean, look at this More Gameplay tab in the settings. It feels like a mod pack, and I love it for that. This game has brought me so much joy, even before I figured out how to make meaningful mods for it. And to see it all become stagnant so soon is a reality I'm not quite ready to face just yet. So if we want to keep the ever-growing database ever-growing, let's play the game. Invite your friends to Survey Scramble game nights, test the limits of your skill. And if we want more lists to be available to us in the future, the most important thing we can do is to simply answer surveys in the lobby. Before surveys are available for gameplay, they'll often show up here. Answering those surveys in the lobby probably means more to the game than you think. So this is where we are at the moment. The Jackbox Survey Scramble has received some new functionality that hint towards the game's stagnation, which is further backed up by the lack of updates on the server end. So now that there's support for the worst case scenario, who knows what could happen to this game in the future. But whatever may happen, let's do our best to take care of this game and keep its legacy alive. And if it does stop becoming the dynamic game it once was, then we can still play a part in keeping its gameplay alive with our own hands. In any case, however, I will still be eternally grateful for the experiences I've had with this game already, and however many more are to come. Thank you Jackbox for making such an incredible game, and I hope to see it continue to flourish despite everything. To all of you, sorry for doom posting about this game for what, like almost half an hour now? I swear, this video was not meant to get so apocalyptic. That's just what happens when I write video essays about this stuff. But with all that said, I hope you enjoyed this little discussion, and I hope it inspired you to put this game on your mind a little more. Thank you all for watching everyone, and I'll see you on the flip side. See ya! Wow, it is becoming increasingly apparent that I am definitely gaining a skill in creating Jackbox politics out of thin air. Well, not thin air, the stuff I make is researched of course, but I guess that's partly become my role now in the Jackbox community, being like the only Jackbox video content creator of my particular caliber. But hey, I can't be the only one turning the cogs around here. If I've inspired any of you to make any Jackbox content of your own, then by all means do so. I'd love to see what you make. Also, I should have a new mod for the Jackbox Survey Scramble on my GitHub pretty soon. It'll of course feature local mode, but also 3 new settings that can alter how you interact with list content in the base game. I mean, you've likely seen the floating modifications tab in my settings throughout a lot of the footage of this video, and that's what that tab is for. Though, I'll say it now, unless the local apocalypse happens, the benefits of these settings will really only make themselves well known to the United States player base. Sorry of course to literally everyone else, including my own country, but I hope that these mods can still provide some use to you guys, particularly through local mode. And yeah, that should be everything. Remember of course to like the video, subscribe, all those YouTube buzzwords, and yeah, thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you on the flip side. See ya!